everybody, I'm Natalia Bonner. Welcome back. All right, usually on Mondays I stop in and share a process video. I'm showing you how I'm machine quilting. Let's today take it back all the way to the beginning. We all start somewhere. Trust me, I had never even seen a Longarm machine in person when I bought my first one. So of course I had no idea what I was doing the day they delivered that machine to my first condo. So I thought it would be fun to introduce you today to a Longarm quilting machine and hopefully answer some of your machine quilting questions. I do all of my quilting here on a Gamel 22-inch machine. I've not always quilted on this machine. When I started quilting, I actually started on an 18-inch machine. What does that even mean? When I'm throwing out all these numbers, you're probably thinking the same thing that I thought. What does 22-inch mean? What does 18-inch mean? What does 10 feet mean? Let's go through all of those specifications today. Okay, so my machine here is on the 10-foot frame. There are different sizes of frames that you can get. However, when I started quilting, I only had room in that tiny condo for a 10-foot frame. The 10-foot frame means this table right here that the machine moves around on is 10 feet wide. Now, with a machine that is 10 feet wide, a 10-foot table, you can see here that my leaders do not go all the way to the end. I find that on this size of machine, I have about 100 inches of working space. So that means that I can machine quilt on about 100 inches here. So if the backing of my quilt is less than 100 inches, I've had really great success quilting quilts that large on my 10-foot table. So we've talked about the size of my table. This is a 10-foot table. Now let's talk about my machine here. So I do all of my quilting now on the Gamel 22-inch machine. 22 inches means this space right here. This is my throat space. So you would assume you have about 22 inches of working space with a 22-inch throat. I will show you though, you are going to lose a few inches here with this bar, so I find that I have about 18 inches of good working space, which I find perfect for hand-guided quilting.
Machine maintenance is crucial for ensuring smooth and efficient quilting. I regularly clean my machine using a dust brush and I oil it as needed. Always follow your manufacturer's recommendations. I also change the needle between every quilt, always using the thread manufacturer's recommended needle size. Depending on whether I'll be doing ruler quilting, I either remove or add my ruler base. Also, I like to use Clorox wipes to thoroughly clean the rails, wheels, and my machine between every quilt. Keeping everything in optimal condition really makes a huge difference.
So machine quilting on a Longarm machine does provide some advantages. They do take up a lot of space, but being able to load a quilt and have it nice and flat as you're working makes a huge difference. Let's load a quilt onto my machine and I'll talk you through my process. When loading a quilt onto my Longarm frame, personally, I prefer to pin. I found great success with pinning, so it's just what I'm going to stick with. Now, before I do load the quilt onto my machine, I always start out by laying out the quilt backing, the quilt batting, and the quilt top on a large surface like the floor to make sure that my quilt backing is at least 4 inches larger than the quilt top all the way around, as well as my batting being larger than the quilt top. Why is that important? You're going to see as I load the quilt onto the frame here, I'll lose a little bit of space by attaching the quilt to the frame. I'll also attach clamps to the side of the quilt, which will take up a little bit of space. And also, you probably noticed on my machine, I do have the extended base plate, the ruler plate, and that will take up a little bit of space as well. Also, quilts can kind of grow, they can stretch, just depending on how they are pieced. So having a backing that is extra large always will make your final result better. When loading a quilt, I often recommend that you find the center of your leader here, also the center of your quilt backing, then pin the center to your center marked line. Now from there, you can start to pin all the way out. You'll notice I placed one pin. I'm actually now going to take off my center pin and pin across this top. Once I have this top edge all pinned, now I'm going to pin the bottom edge. Now, like the top, I will find this center point, even if it means folding the quilt and marking, like a finger press to mark that center point, and line it up with the center marked line on your leader. Then from there, I'll either pin to the center point right here, and make sure I can pull it out straight here over on the right side, and then I'll pin across. This is the method that I have found works best for me. If you have found a method that works better for you, stick with that. Quick tip, I like to use corsage pins to pin my quilts to my leaders. Have a little treat. Now I will roll the backing onto the leaders, and this quilt does have some threads on it which I'm going to clean up before I do attach it to my leaders. So I also like to use just a little bit of water in my misting spray bottle and mist any creases in the quilt backing. By misting these and then rolling up the quilt backing, so I'm not saturating, I'm just misting, but then once I roll up the quilt batting, the little bit of misted water will help that fabric relax. Make sure it's filtered water. So once I've misted that backing, I've got it loaded on my machine here, now I'm ready to start rolling it onto my leaders. As I roll, I'm going to be checking to make sure that it's rolling nice and straight, especially if you're working with a pieced backing. Sometimes they can start to get a little bit wonky, so I'll roll slow and check as I go. If any adjustments need to be made, any smoothing, flattening, I will do that. Now, once I've got everything all rolled up here on the machine, I'll make sure it's not too tight. Often when I share my machine quilting videos, it looks like my quilts are super duper tight on my machine. That's because the power of the camera. So, make sure that you do have a little bit of give and play. You don't want your quilts too tight on the frame. Okay, next up is batting. It's time to load the batting. on this incredible dolly quilt. The quilt top itself is actually pretty heavy, and my quilting is really going to be holding the quilt together. So obviously I'm adding a bit of interest with my machine quilting, but I don't want to be adding a lot of loft. That's why I love the Quilter's Dream blend batting. One other thing, this is actually the only batting that I will use out of a bag. All other battings I will not use if they're not off the roll. I already know that my batting is large enough, so I'm going to unroll the batting and lay it out flat on the backing. If I need to trim it down, I will at this point. Always smoothing as I go. I don't like to float my quilt tops, so next I'm going to tuck my batting between my bars and then we'll load the quilt top. Now you might be wondering, why is her long arm set so high? I do have another video here on our YouTube channel where I talk about just that. Why is my long arm set so high? More smoothing. Usually when I load a quilt onto the frame, it can take up to an hour to prep and load. And now it's time to load the most iconic quilt. Now this quilt's going to present a new challenge because you can see I can only work with a small portion of dolly at a time, but it's going to be so much fun, and I will for sure be sharing my full process in the Piece and Quilt Academy. I start out when I load my quilt tops by smoothing the top, making sure it fits where I want it to be. I like to pin, I don't like to float my quilt tops. So I'll bring up that bottom edge and I'm going to pin it. So once I have the quilt where I want it on the frame, then I'm going to pin it to my leader. Once I have this bottom edge all pinned to my leader, now I'm going to roll it down onto the leaders. A lot of quilters like to float their quilts, meaning they don't attach this bottom end to the leaders. Personally, I've just found great success by taking the time and attaching it to my leader. Once I've rolled it down, I'm not pulling it tight, so I have a little bit of play still. Now I'm going to start my basting. I like to work with the Super Bob pre-wound bobbins, these ones right here. So I'm going to actually be using several colors here on this quilt, but we're going to be starting out up here in the top left corner. I'll be working through this quilt top to bottom, left to right. So I am going to start out using the pre-wound bobbins, the Super Bobs, placing that in my bobbin and getting started. Now to work with your tension, I love this bottom line thread. I've had really great success with it. It's also led to really great tension. I do recommend, if you're struggling with your tension, check out your owner's manual and use a TOA bobbin gauge. That can help you set your bobbin tension to the correct tension, and then you can use these awesome bobbins. But that is a setting that I do recommend that you check with your machine manufacturer to see exactly where your machine tension should be set. Place the bobbin in there, pull it through. Always make sure that you thread it the right way. I am also going to change the thread on the top. I don't like to unthread my machine when I do this, so let's hop over here and I'll show you how I pull it through. I like to change my thread from the front of the machine. So I'll bring my machine as far forward as I can, and I'll reach back here to the back, clip my thread, make sure I have like a long tail. Then I'll grab my new cone of thread. Here I'm choosing to start out with So Fine color number 411. Find the end, tie the two threads together. You may even have to do a double knot, but once I have that knot, then I'm going to be careful and pull my thread all the way up to the front of the machine. I'll rethread this thread through the needle of my machine. I did already change the needle back when I cleaned the machine, so I've got a brand new needle. And now I'm ready to begin basting. So this is how I baste all of my quilts. I've got it all nice and flat. I'm going to start up here in the center at the top. Take a single stitch, pull my thread up to the top. Once everything is on the top, I'm either going to run just a simple straight stitch across the top edge going out to the right, then I'll come back and work out to the left, or I might do a long single stitch, just one stitch at a time. It might take a little bit longer to do that single stitch, but sometimes I feel like it helps me keep the quilt nice and flat. So let's do that single stitch. This quilt does include a lot of bulk. It is pieced on the grid. So because it's pieced on the grid, and these pieces are incredibly tiny, I want to make sure it's nice and flat and I'm not dealing with any unnecessary thread breakages. So I'll slow down and take it one stitch at a time. And I'll repeat that process all the way over to the right. I'm always stopping and clipping threads. So once I've stitched my basting stitch all the way across this top edge of my quilt, now I'm going to tighten up my backing. Remember, not too tight, but also the top. There's still a bit of play here, which is what I want. Nice and not too tight. Now I'm going to run a simple stitch right here down each side of my quilt. And as I work my way through this quilt, that is how I will baste. As I quilt this whole entire pass, then I will advance the quilt and I will stitch down the left side, also the right side, and I'll repeat that process. Once I get to the bottom of the quilt, I will unattach the quilt top from the leaders, run just a single long basting stitch across the bottom edge, and then finish quilting there. So let's get to it. When I run this long basting stitch, my stitches are usually about 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch apart. Usually I'll take a few stitches back and forth at the bottom just to secure my threads. And now I'll repeat that process on the second side. Now you can set up the gamble machines to run a basting stitch Personally, I've just found great success with taking a single stitch. I feel like it allows me a little bit more control. Yes, it's more time consuming. I'm probably wearing out the buttons on my machine a little faster, but I love the results that I end up with. Now the last part of the basting process is adding some clamps to the side. I will add 2 clamps to the left side and also the right side. These help keep the quilt nice and flat on the frame. Remember, when you attach your clamps, you want them tight, but not too tight. My quilt is all loaded, and now I'm ready to begin machine quilting. Before I begin machine quilting though, I am going to run just a few test stitches. Let's see how I do that. Let's start out by pulling my thread up to the top of the machine. So this is how I always stop and start. Here you can see my top thread. I am going to take a single stitch. Once I've taken that one stitch, I can pull the machine away. As I pull away my machine, you can see the loop that is formed. That is my bobbin thread. Now I'll pull that. I'm pulling both of my threads up to the top, my bobbin thread and also my top thread. To start out my quilting, I'll take a few stitches, maybe even just those simple single stitches right kind of back and forth. You can also engage the machine and kind of create like a bar tack. Once that's complete, I'll test out my quilting. So I'm testing it here on the side. Obviously it's not on the quilt at this point, but I'm just going to run a few stitches and see if I'm liking the way the thread is running. It looks like it's running well to me. So at this point, generally, I'll run just a straight stitch along that basting stitch to make sure that it's going to run the same way on the fabric. And it looks like it's stitching beautifully. I am so excited to get quilting on this incredible dolly quilt. Hey everybody, I hope you found a little bit of inspiration, hopefully a few tips and tricks that helped you on your machine quilting process. If you have more questions about starting out machine quilting, leave a comment, let me know. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See y'all next week.